Welcome to filmmakeru.com live. Every Friday we go live with a post-professional to discuss the ins and outs of the film industry. This week we have Maya Mumma. Maya, welcome to the show. Now you've been primarily working in documentary. So the film that I was really excited to see with my wife was OJ Made in America. So how did you get involved with that project?
I got involved in that project in a way that a lot of documentary editors do, is that we get referred to for jobs by people that we've worked with before. Mm-hmm. So I'd collaborated with some editors who were mentors of mine as I was coming up in the industry, both as a assistant editor and a junior editor. That's really the way you get to kind of know people, and people really get to know your work, and then you start to get your name passed around for different jobs. So my name got sent to Ezra Edelman, the director of OJ Made in America, and he first emailed me about it and just kind of said like a long film about OJ Simpson, and I was first kind of like, I don't know. I experienced the OJ trial as a teenager, and knew OJ from his movies actually more than football, even though my dad was a huge OJ football fan. But then I went and met with Ezra. Kind of interviewed with him, but it was more to kind of hear his vision for the film. And what he told me was so much more than I had ever kind of expected or conceptualized about what the story could be, or what the story that he wanted to tell was. And I think when I'm looking for a documentary to work on, and I think in general across the industry, you want to be looking at or working on stories that give a new perspective or an interesting perspective that are just beyond kind of the basic levels of exploration. And what Ezra wanted to do is incredibly complex and incredibly relevant. And it just was fascinating to me. So I signed up. They had already had one other editor signed on to do it. So there were two of us when we started. And it was originally supposed to be kind of like 4 or 5 hours. That was kind of the general sense. And then we just started cutting. And we brought on a third editor about halfway through as well too, because neither of us could get to the end of the storytelling, post-trial. And the story really evolved. Ezra had an incredible vision across the project of the story that he wanted to tell, but how we would tell that complex story and how the different elements wove together was really something that we knew we would have to tackle in the edit. So we brought on, there were 3 of us by the end, and 1 assistant editor for most of the time, which is crazy thinking about it now. But he managed a lot. It was a really incredible kind of energetic team that just really was all invested in it and really kept things moving. So there weren't kind of the normal challenges in that way. Like, I had the materials to make the film what it needed to be always. And it was an incredibly challenging story to put together. And I guess I don't want to work on a project that's simple. Not that any film project has ever been simple, but this one was so challenging and so interesting to me that I absolutely was, ready to do it when after I talked to Ezra.
So what were the discussions like with Ezra to make sure that this didn't end up being just another doc about OJ or another story?
It was about films should have a thesis. It was about kind of a thesis of why, kind of how, looking at kind of what people know OJ best for, which is unfortunately the trial, and kind of the verdict and America's reaction to it. So it was less about whether he was guilty or not, that trial. It's about how America reacted to it. So to understand how America reacted to it, what do we need to tell? Well, we need to go all the way back to the beginning and talk about both OJ, and we need to talk about America. So looking at those kind of divergent threads and convergent threads through OJ's life rooted in the African-American community in America, rooted in Los Angeles, rooted in the police, all the kind of things that come together in the actual murder and the trial. So how do you pull back and tell that story? Mm-hmm. And that's that was the meat of what we had to work with. And then looking at kind of where he went after that, what that kind of symbolized afterwards too. So it was just super, super complex, but really, really incredible, and felt very urgent to kind of tackle those narratives, to kind of peel back and step back from kind of where we are today and understand why we are where we are today in different ways. I always love films a lot of the films I work on deal with history, that look back. But if you're looking back, you should always be, I think, looking back to understand something about right now, or in conjunction with that, thinking about the future as well too. So it's an interesting way to do that. And OJ was just an incredible way to kind of look at our country.
Yeah. I almost feel like the sequel will be Donald Trump Made in America.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I feel like people are on that, have their finger on that pulse too. But it's a similar, like, if people don't understand kind of how something can happen. And with OJ, that was the idea of there are people on both sides of kind of ideas of the verdict who couldn't understand either side of it. And as people start to kind of understand complexity, there's also a bit of people starting to understand each other a bit more as well too, which I think is important when we're looking at these kinds of issues in our society.
What's crazy is I was a teenager too when the trial was going on, and I remember rushing. My friend's mother was a lawyer, and so she was obsessed with the trial, and it was always fascinating to talk to her because she had all these theories and was like, oh, this is how they're going to tackle this. Because since then I've heard numerous theories about what really happened. Is there any that you guys explored or thought about adding to the show?
It's interesting. I read a lot about them, and it was fascinating. But I think what our mantra, it was kind of easy sometimes to get tempted to explore those. But ultimately, kind of our mantra for it was, this isn't about OJ, it's about America, which is how the title kind of came about too.
Yeah.
And a lot of people's reactions to that. So it was a questioning whether those things helped us understand the story or not. A lot of the things that we actually did look at were kind of OJ and his football injuries. And there's kind of people kind of talk about CTE and that kind of stuff as an idea, but that's something that, again, can't be really scientifically confirmed. So again, we were kind of looking at what helped push the narrative forward in terms of this bigger story that we were telling as well too. Some of those may have taken us on some divergent paths, but the conspiracy theories are particularly fascinating. When I'd be having a hard day, I'd go and read conspiracy theories.
So, like, one of the storylines that I found fascinating was his relationship with race and trying not to be who he was in a sense. How did you guys go? Because essentially that takes up a good chunk of one of the episodes. So how did you guys go about setting that story up? What kind of footage did you guys get in? Did you have to dig for that information and get it? Or
it was so I guess to start off with, the Ezra, the director of OJ, is one of the most incredible interviewers as a director that I have ever seen. Like, just incredible. We had incredible interviews. Even if they were short, they were the meat, kind of what we needed was in there. And with that in mind, kind of what he was starting to explore with the themes of the film, he really got people to kind of open up and talk about that in unexpected ways sometimes as well. Kind of letting people talk about their experience and then seeing how there were different perspectives of that experience. And a lot of that, I mean, his career as a football player started as a college student. So, and there are a lot of kind of issues or interesting things to explore around USC. So that's where we decided to kind of root the beginning of the story in that way, was at USC. So his kind of emergence as a public figure in some way started there. And USC is interesting in its geography, which we explore in the film, where it is in Los Angeles, kind of where it exists in the kind of cultural and social hierarchy of universities as well, and kind of how OJ became who he was, as a public figure, started there. And so there are some really just kind of incredible and insightful things that I think came out of the interviews there. People asking, Ezra asks one of his football players on his team, when you think of 1968, what do you think of? And he thinks of them winning games and doing amazingly. And if you ask somebody else what you think of 1968, there's other things outside of that you think about. And we were looking at kind of that polarization of kind of points of view of kind of where people were in their world. And OJ was very much in that kind of USC bubble where all of a sudden he's, being hoisted on people's shoulders and, becoming legendary. And then there's lots of other things kind of happening out in the world that he can either choose to be a part of, as a public figure, or not be a part of. And he starts to make those decisions there. So that's where we kind of started the story in that way. And luckily we had amazing footage because it was USC and there's a film school. They would send out film students to film stuff all the time. So there was this really beautiful actual film from there. We had they filmed OJ like walking around the campus with his first wife and all this incredible stuff. And because he became known very quickly, there was quite a bit of material on him, and he started to work in television and had these little guest spots, and then became a professional football player. So there was quite a bit of documentation. There were actually, I know on every film is different, and there are films that you definitely struggle to pull together kind of visuals and materials to make something filmic. The most challenging part was definitely his childhood, which wasn't very well documented at all, but we were able to find archival materials from the time, which very much spoke to it. We talk about San Francisco, and we actually have footage that is from the exact year and literally the exact spot, where his father lived. Wow. The bus route is that's exactly where it was. When you have also an amazing archival producer, that also kind of helps. But that part of the process is always a dialogue during the edit too. We're always having a dialogue about what we could need, what we have, and what we can get and what we can't get. And then sometimes there are these kind of little magical things that pop up that you don't really think about. There was this kind of it was weird, almost PR footage behind the scenes when he did one of his early movies, which is a movie that nobody has ever seen, but it's this really interesting footage of him. And we use it at several points. It's these really interesting close-ups of him while he's being interviewed. And then he's in this room, with a bunch of Hollywood people, clapping. And that became very kind of symbolic at a certain point of him kind of choosing kind of where he would exist in Los Angeles. And that was something where I didn't know how to kind of cover that scene. And the archival producer was like, remember that weird footage of the release of, I think it's called Goldie and the Bear or something, but it's just, almost like scrap film. But when you start to weave people talking and pointing you towards ideas, little bits of footage like that, a bunch of white people clapping for him in Hollywood, can make a point very quickly. So if anything, we had at certain points too much footage, or a lot, or so much to go through the trial. I did the first 3 hours. And so the trial was kind of its own beast in a way. And it was because it was broadcast, there was just kind of endless coverage of it, but also in its own way, it's, courtroom footage and filmed from very specific angles. And, it's not like you have a million different cutaways. And so that was also a challenge in its own way too.
So what's fascinating about his story is it's very Shakespearean almost, right? Here's this guy who desires something and he does whatever it takes to get it, and then he gets what he wants.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And then there's usually people who experience that have to have some sort of fall in some way. And that fall, we have Zoe Tour in the film, talks about it. She describes it as this epic fall. And it is Shakespearean in that way. And it's funny, there's the very first film I ever worked on as an assistant, we struggled to kind of find that comparison of how to kind of frame the film. And Hamlet was always what came up too. There was something kind of about the kind of tropes and archetypes, I think, of Shakespeare and the way of storytelling that I think comes into film a lot too. We think about film in terms of acts a lot. And a lot of people with OJ ask us about kind of the division points of it and how it was ultimately ended up broadcast and shown in theaters. And we very much worked across the film and across the storytelling with the edit, and didn't keep it in, divided, other than for the sake of Avid not crashing. So we had it. But when we looked at it, it was very natural in these kind of 3-act, 90-minute things, these beats. It just kind of naturally sorted itself in that way, because I think that's storytelling also. There's something in us kind of innate in how you tell these arcs. So every kind of 90 minutes has its own arc in a way, and they were about 90 minutes when we looked at it. So it was kind of not magical. I think it was kind of indicative of storytelling and how you tell a compelling story also, that it sorts that way kind of naturally.
Now, you said at the start that you love films that challenge you. So what was challenging in this, or what is something that stood out for you as a challenging moment that you were excited to?
I think the most challenging was weaving weaving OJ's story in his pre-murder, weaving OJ's story with the LAPD and history of Los Angeles as well, because we knew that was incredibly vital to the storytelling. But I don't want to say it didn't have anything to do with OJ. It did, but it didn't have anything directly to do with OJ. So tackling the LA riots, for example, the beating of Rodney King through the LA riots, that arc was actually one of the first things I took on. Which was also great in that kind of structure that we had to be able to, we decided to take on sections where we had material and also sections that we knew were important and start to work with those and figure out kind of through that what the language of the film would be. So I had a feeling that would be, that kind of interplay of those stories would be kind of one of the most challenging parts of the edit itself. So I took on that section first. I actually took on the LA riots first, and then went back and kind of built out the front of it with Rodney King. And once we started to find the language in that, it kind of allowed us to have the confidence that we could find a way to kind of work these stories together. And they existed as pieces for a long time, kind of as we were building different pieces. So it was like I would work on the LAPD or Los Angeles, and I would go back and work on something about OJ and kind of start to see how those sections interact. And then work on making them interact in an interesting way. But being able to tell kind of, those stories are as important as OJ's stories. So they are as epic and as nuanced and complicated as his story is as well too. So giving it also its due attention, I think, was very important. And also something that was incredibly important across the entire film was working with interviews, which again, we had incredible interview material. And Ezra, I think, very much had this natural instinct for people talking with agency and authority and experience. So that when you hear people talking, they've experienced it. They're not just an expert about something. They're directly connected to it in some way. So also creating that experience as we go through, that these are all people that are interconnected in this complicated story, is really important. So we looked at kind of different people and how they wove through the film as well. And one person that we gave a lot of attention to that took time to kind of figure out too was Ron Shipp, who was a police officer in the LAPD who ultimately kind of became friends with OJ and then testified against him at the trial. And in order for that moment later in the trial to have some sort of resonance, we needed to understand who Ron Shipp was, but we needed to understand him on an incredibly deep emotional level. We all felt that. But how he interacted with the story, and he interacted with the story in all these little places in fascinating ways, like literally going to USC as a teenager and watching OJ play and being starstruck by him there, then becoming an LAPD officer and realizing like OJ is on his beat, he's in the neighborhood. So he can become friends. And that's such a fascinating journey, but it also gives him agency in the storytelling as well, to understand his perspective on what made everything so complicated. And that kind of stuff takes a lot of thought and it takes a lot of work. And it came from the interview where Ezra it's like he knew all that stuff going into it. He knew this guy's story all the way and made sure to have him talk about all these things, which some people would see as disparate, I think, not see the connections between them, but they were really deep and rich connections. Also, Zoe Tour, the helicopter pilot who filmed the Bronco chase, also filmed the beating of Reginald Denny during the LA riots, and which is just not a coincidence. It's like it's an important part of the storytelling. So we kind of pioneered that helicopter journalism in a really interesting way, but her point of view is also really important to that because they were engaged in the story also in that way too. So, and then Zoe also grew up in Brentwood. So Zoe can talk about growing up in Brentwood, which is where, OJ ended up moving to. So kind of looking for those things and giving them attention in the storytelling is really important. And it's something that I think I had always felt, but with OJ became just an incredibly strong conviction that I think I take with me everywhere else, is always thinking about who's speaking and who has the authority to speak, and giving people the space to speak and tell their stories. Because every story we're telling is complex in some way, even if it's about somebody, a biography of somebody, everybody else is directly connected to that as well, and they have their own stories that contribute to it. So I'm always kind of measuring when I'm putting a scene together, thinking about kind of how that person fits into the story and finding the way to let them speak. Also,
how do you like to approach? Like I think about whenever I've cut doc footage. It's sort of this thing where you're sitting there staring at an empty timeline, like a writer stares at an empty page, and it's like, got all this footage and it could go anywhere. So how do you approach your first cut or your first pass? Like, how do you figure out the structure?
Well, I do a lot of research. I do a lot of thinking about the topic as well, because a lot of the stuff I do is historical, even if it's recent history. What I do is I make pretty intense timelines where I map out, especially if it's a biographical film, I map out the person who the film is about, all sorts of different beats of their life, personal, public, because a lot of times I'm exploring public figures. Usually that's why we're exploring them, personal and public. And then I look at, depending on kind of what the lens is of the story, I look at things that are happening in public kind of in relation to that. So what's going on socially, what's going on politically. So with OJ, I had this kind of massive timeline, especially because we had these dueling timelines of the LAPD in Los Angeles. So I had, the history of the LAPD mapped out, the history of Los Angeles. And I create I actually do it visually. I do a board in my edit room. And I'm actually constantly kind of looking at it as I go through the film and reminding myself kind of where I am in time and what the things are that are interconnected. With the James Brown film that I did this kind of map of James Brown's life personally, professionally, songs, when they were written and then when they came out. And then also because we were looking at kind of the interplay of him and American political and social culture at the same time, kind of what was going on in America at the same time. And you start to see these really fascinating clusters of things that are happening concurrently. Like he writes Cold Sweat, which is kind of universally called one of the first funk songs. And you look at it's written, at the beginning of the summer of '67, which is a really, a shift kind of in America. It was a summer of rioting, and you can hear that music. It's playing on people's, car radios. It's playing in people's homes. It's like there's something kind of in that. So you start to look at kind of how those things start to intersect. And in intersection and complexity is where storytelling is. So I often do a large kind of like timeline map. I have it in Excel now because I don't have a board at home. But I look at that, and that's sort of how I start to map out what I want to tell. I'm kind of a strong believer in chronology and the natural chronology of people's lives and the inherent kind of drama of what you're looking at. Everybody has peaks and lows in their life. So I look for those kind of the natural storytelling. So I often look to that as kind of the building blocks of where to start the film. So looking at eras of people's lives, what parts of those do we need to explore? What are we trying to kind of say? So where do we need to kind of go with certain elements of it? Also, what do we have material for different elements of it? And then I also start to think about the more kind of idea-based and maybe deeper explorations of people that may not be tied to a specific event or a time, but kind of ideas, learning about, that something about, maybe it's a departure where you're learning something about their backstory, about their family, or learning something about them personally. I did a film on Martin Luther King, and there's a moment where we kind of pull back. He's gone through a super, super challenging moment, but he's seeing a psychiatrist, like he's in therapy. And it's important to kind of understand at that moment that he's, not fallible in some way, that he needed help kind of processing what he was doing and struggled with, depression and kind of the weight of what he was doing. So you take a little kind of departure moment to talk about somebody, and those moments hopefully will help you understand them better as you continue on their journey. So I'm always looking for then those kind of moments of departure where you start to kind of unpack and explore and make something more complex. And those are things that kind of come usually later after there's a kind of a basic structure laid out. And those are the moments that are, I think, sometimes most challenging to create, but also the most rewarding in the end.
This is like a side question, but, I remember going on a tour of Motown, and they were talking about how they would have one song written and it would be played by this band. If it didn't hit, then they would put it with this band. And and apparently that was done a lot. In the industry, in the music industry. So was there a lot of James Brown's music being played or by other musicians that you tracked, or was it?
No, it was all his. I mean, he had kind of this core band that was his. It was very much his. So it was always very much kind of, and actually that's one of the things that we explore a little bit in that film too, kind of the singularity of James Brown versus the contributions of the people in his band. You know, very often someone would come up with a beat and it would create a song from that. But it was very much this unit in a way. So it was his music was very much authentically his, which gave me a lot to work with in that way too. That it often was kind of inspired in the moment and by collaboration also, which is very interesting as well too. So we were able to kind of explore that. And we also had incredible access to his archives in a way too, and his archives from Universal. So we had some stems of the original recordings and kind of all the stuff where we could hear. And that was also part of if we have the musicians talking about kind of the process of, someone would start to do a drum beat and someone would add something and James Brown would just start kind of like saying some lyrics. We actually had the ability to kind of see if we could recreate that or isolate that in some way. And those are kind of magical things that you have. Yeah. I mean, the worst thing you would want is to do a film about a musician and then like not have access to their music or, be limited by that in some way. Which is always like a blessing with something like that.
What was it like to hear the stems and the outtakes?
Oh, it was amazing. Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, it felt like we have a lot of power as editors in a way, to kind of how we work with material, but to kind of get to pretend like we were, in the mix room and be able to isolate, the different instruments and how they were layered together. And we had incredible interviews with the actual musicians also, which was important. Again, kind of going back to agency and having the musicians there to talk about their own process, and that was very important, as opposed to a bunch of people saying like, James Brown music was amazing. They were like, actually, we were up in the middle of the night and James Brown made us start recording, but somehow we made this incredible song. Here it is. And then we have the ability to kind of recreate that. So that was often, those things were often guided. It was cool that we had those stems, but if we didn't have strong storytelling to go with them, the use of them would kind of be a little kind of unnecessary. But because we have that strong storytelling from people who were there in the room, using them then becomes an incredible storytelling tool.
I do want to just say that Eric in our feed says that he loves your process and it's amazing.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. It's a long process. It's interesting when I make my timeline board, I found that some directors look at it and they kind of scratch their heads and they're like, that's not the film. And I'm like, yes, it's not like what's in the edit, but it's the story that we're trying to tell, and not everything on that board is it's not like nothing is reflective of like the scenes in the film, but it's how I continue to think about things constantly and how things are interconnected. So then I make up, but what's interesting too is that I know a lot of editors work with like story cards and boards and stuff like that, but because I do that process with that timeline, my ultimate board is much more simple because I feel like I go through a lot of the storytelling process by brainstorming on that board. So I have a fairly kind of refined sense of what the story is going to be at a certain point. And I don't like stare at the board, but I also, when I work on more kind of verite based films where that you do have like a lot more different scenes and options and stuff like that, I feel like those kind of edit boards come into play a lot more. So
now you've talked about directors. How do you like to work with a director to find their vision? Because essentially like they're going to come in and say, yes, we're telling the story of O.J. Simpson or James Brown or Martin Luther King, but they all have a style or a desire to tell it in a certain way. So how do you make sure that you're on the same page? What's your approach?
Yeah, it's always a process. I mean, for me, it's about listening to the intentions of their storytelling, kind of what was sparked their interest in even telling the story and why they went to tell it. And then looking at what they got in the field, because usually when I'm starting, I mean, hopefully there's stuff that's been filmed and archival that's been gathered for the most part. I've never worked on a project where literally everything was in the bag when I started the edit. Usually there's some stuff that rolls in kind of during that process. So I look at kind of what they have and what they want to make out of it and what story they want to tell in a way. And usually it's a big idea. And I feel like my job as an editor is to find kind of the smallness of it, all the intricacies to tell that big story. So I feel like what I do is then step back and I look at the footage and I both look at kind of, okay, what do we have to actually tell the story, but also what story or stories is actually here in the footage. There may be something kind of deeper and more nuanced that we can explore than just kind of the initial idea of what it is, especially when you're doing like a biography of somebody. I feel like there's always little kind of interesting things that come up and interesting bits of storytelling that kind of really help you make a more complex portrait than you maybe thought you would. And a lot of that comes from the interplay between the archival footage that you find, because when you start out, you don't always know what you're going to get. And then with the interviews, and also looking for moments of kind of unexpectedness and surprise in the interviews, which I think there always is in some way. You know, as a director, you go in and you have a list of questions you want to ask, but there's always something that comes up that is unexpected in a way. And as an editor, I'm always looking for those moments, because those are the things that stand out to me a lot. And sometimes it's a thing that just either the person just starts to offer up, or, you know, kind of they go off on a tangent, but sometimes those things are unexpected bits of storytelling that you never really thought would come into play. On the Martin Luther King film, there's a woman, Zernona Clayton, who they interviewed, who was kind of really in King's inner circle and kind of worked as like a behind the scenes person with both Coretta and Martin Luther King. And they had basically stopped the interview, and then she just started talking, and she told the story. She told the story basically of like Martin Luther King's children not wanting to let him go to Memphis, essentially right before he was assassinated. Like they physically tried to stop him from doing it, like, you know, holding the door and like saying, don't go, like, and he's like, I've got stuff to do, I have to go. And it was just this beautiful,
I gotta help work to end racism.
Yeah, exactly. And the kids are like, no, but knowing that ultimately us knowing what was going to happen, it's an incredibly moving and eerie story in a way. And she just kind of offered it up at the end. And it was almost like the DP was like, oh, okay, we're still filming here, and we got it. And we ended up opening the film with it because it was we were looking at kind of the end of his life in a way, the last few years and those challenges, and to kind of open up with this very personal, interesting story was not what anybody intended, I think, when they conceptualized the film. But it ended up becoming an incredible way to kind of root the audience in the fact that we were telling kind of an introspective, personal, this was only being told by people who knew him, directly, who were there, an intimate, personal story that we were going to go kind of behind the public figure. And what a better way to do that than to talk about this moment with his children from somebody who witnessed it. It was just an incredible way. So you can kind of, in that way, throw out some of your initial ideas of kind of how you would start a film or what you want it to be, and go with those things that kind of hit you in the gut more. And that really set the tone for the entire film. And who knew that? So, yeah.
Now, I have one last question that I like to ask everyone I interview. What would you say is your favorite guilty pleasure film to watch?
Oh, guilty pleasure film. I have to say, I do love, thinking back, before I was in documentaries, I actually started in theater, and I thought I was a director and I wanted to do fiction film, but I got really interested in documentaries. And now that I think about it, I watched Best in Show when I was in college, Christopher Guest, mockumentaries. Yeah. I watched actually all of his mockumentaries, Spinal Tap. I would watch those on permanent repeat. Yeah. And part of me wonders now, I hadn't actually thought about it until now, but part of me thinks that there was something kind of wheels that were starting to turn in my head, but I could turn those on at any part of the day. And I think they're brilliant. So they're not guilty pleasures in that way. I will say that during the pandemic, I've watched all the John Wick movies, which is not something I maybe would have done pre-pandemic. But I do love, it's interesting. I do love storytelling. And I think that's something that's always been my focus when I looked at fiction films, less than the technical aspects. When I became an editor, I didn't really have, or when I started to kind of discover it, I didn't have a sense of what editors did. It wasn't something that as a child, I was looking at a film and going, oh, the editing was really amazing in that. I was thinking about the storytelling. And I think that also kind of is a part of who I am. And so anything with strong storytelling, it can be any kind of film. I'm a sucker for coming of age movies. Love that. I love anything that's kind of about a challenging era, I guess, in someone's life, and kind of how you look, how somebody goes through that. I love war movies because of that. Fiction, Hollywood war, because there's something really interesting about how you kind of look at humanity through, something that is challenging to someone. And I think maybe that's what I'm kind of looking for in the storytelling that I'm doing in documentary as well. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for letting me interview.
Cool. No, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Enjoy your long week. Oh, sorry. I'm calling from Canada. I was about to say happy Thanksgiving because we have Thanksgiving this weekend.
No. Even if it was, I have too much work to do. So
enjoy your regular weekend.
Yes, thank you.
Have a good one.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.